made a mistake.
My name is Grover Cleveland. I was born March 18th, 1837, and I was named Stephen Grover Cleveland after the previous pastor. I was the third son and fifth child of my parents. Now, as I get older, I don't want to go through life with the name Stephen Cleveland. Rhymes a little bit too much. Even then, people are, like myself, maybe a little bit on the vain side, okay? But this is indeed my birthplace right over here. And so this is what my birthplace looked like in the 1930s for the centennial of my birth in 1937. This is was a WPA project to restore the museum, to restore the house to be used as a full museum. And so, like many, many historical spots here in New Jersey, this was a WPA project, and it was rededicated on my birthday in 1937. And among the schools I went to were the Fayetteville Academy, and I had the idea of going to Hamilton College. But, well, my father was a hardworking clergyman who never made much money. He and my mother raised 9 children. It certainly reflects the qualities of pluck and endurance, which made the people what they are. But before attending college, my father dies. So there's no money for me to go to college. I had to help support the family, all right? So that's kind of maybe a defining moment that you see right over here. What does that look like to you?
A hospital.
It looks like a hospital. It certainly looks like an institution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it's actually the New York Institute for Special Education, then known as the New York Institute for the Blind. William worked there, my brother, and got me a job at the school. First as a clerk and later as a secretary and teacher of English. I taught math, English, geography in the literary department. I was only 16 years old.
Wow.
And William and I sent home money when we could. So I stayed at the school in T. Colden Cooper. And I was headed to Cleveland, Ohio, where I did have family, similar name there, with a couple of friends. I did have some distant family members. And in Buffalo, when I made it to Buffalo, New York, I stopped by staying with my uncle. He convinced me to settle in Buffalo. So through these years, I read for the law. And these were the days that lawyers did not attend law school. Calvin Coolidge is probably the last president who did not attend law school.
Wow.
Franklin Roosevelt went for 2 years, dropped out, but he still passed the bar.
Oh.
Harry Truman attended law school, but he left for a variety of reasons. Okay, but he was extremely well read. And of course, the most well-known person is Abraham Lincoln, who really never set his foot much in any classroom at all, but he could have very well been the most read president he'd ever had. Well, during the Civil War, well, before that, I read for the law for the Buffalo law firm of Rogers, Bowen, and Rogers. And eventually I became known for having a strong work ethic. And during the Civil War, I hired a substitute and didn't fight so I can take care of my family. Through the years, I served as assistant district attorney in Buffalo. I developed a law practice with Albert Lanning and Oscar Folsom. I was sheriff of Erie County and took the responsibility of hanging 2 men, feeling the responsibility of executing would fall on me. That was a Jeopardy question a few weeks back. I was then a partner with Bass and Bissell and Still. As one colleague said, time after time, he would remain here all night in the office working on cases. And eventually I was elected mayor of Buffalo in 1881 and governor of New York in 1882. Not a big time span there, right? And then eventually, of course, I become president of the United States in 1884 and 1892. Now, in recent years, one of my successors, Barack Obama, really had a rapid rise to the presidency. And they said how unheard of this was. Well, I did it, other people did it. Mm-hmm. This was a really short amount of time that I went from being a lawyer to mayor to governor to president. So that was a very common thing. Okay.
Thank you.
So what do you see here? I know it's hard for you to see from there.
I can see.
vetoed
Vetoing
a
a
lot.
lot of things here, huh?
Yeah, I was the veto mayor, I was the veto governor, I was the veto president. And if you go closely to that cartoon, you can see the bags under my eyes from working too hard, okay? I never let future electoral prospects influence my decision making. There is not enough time to spotlight any examples of using the veto while serving as mayor or governor. However, I'm going to give you some examples of me as president. I was known for advocating for limited government, intervention in the economy, and I opposed what was viewed as the excesses of the progressive movement. I vetoed a total of 584 bills during my presidency.
Wow.
That's the 2 terms. One such veto was the Texas Seed Bill. This legislation was designed to provide assistance to farmers in Texas during the drought. My argument was that it would be beneficial. It was unconstitutional for the federal government to distribute aid to individuals. Another example was the Federal Elections Bill in 1990. This bill was set up to federalize election procedures. However, many saw this as an attempt to secure democratic power in the South. I felt it infringed upon states' rights and would be too much federal outreach. There was also the pension bill. This was to increase pensions for Civil War veterans. I also opposed parts of the pension bill which aimed to pay back pension benefits to those who had not received them. My concern, though, was fraud and abuse. Although my political opponents and allies were frustrated with me with the vetoes of these bills, it reinforced my image as a strong leader who would not give in to politics. Now, I've got 2 pictures up here, and it tells 2 different stories here. Okay. And the one on the left is, obviously you can see, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And the one on the right takes place more on the eastern part of the United States. In 1882, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was signed because Chinese workers in western states were willing to work for wages lower than white labor, and the Chinese were accused of refusing to assimilate. In practice, the act prohibited almost all existing immigrants from obtaining citizenship, and Chinese individuals couldn't leave the U.S. without first applying for a certificate of reentry. I signed the Scott Act, which prohibited reentry altogether. I wanted to strengthen the previous Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred the immigration of the Chinese to the United States. I believe that cultural differences made the Chinese unable to assimilate, and that the anti-Chinese hostility made the West unsafe for them. So to sum up, although I condemned the poor treatment of the Chinese, I concluded that prejudice toward the Chinese was so deep on the western side of the United States, and their culture was so alien, that the Chinese could not assimilate into American society. But on the other hand, that's where European immigration, and here's an example of, I vetoed a bill prohibiting immigration for the illiterate. My actual words, in my opinion, it is infinitely more safe to admit 100,000 immigrants who, unable to read and write, seek among us only a home and opportunity to work, than to admit one of those unruly agitators and enemies of governmental control, who can not only read and write. Violence and disorder did not originate with illiterate laborers. So there's an inconsistency here between the Asian and European immigrants. I gave this presentation last week, and a person in the audience says that maybe the difference is that the European immigrants come with families, the Chinese come to work, and there's more intense competition with the Chinese as far as the work was going. Perhaps. I, of course, gave opening remarks at the Statue of Liberty dedication in 1886, including, "A stream of light shall pierce the darkness, ignorance, and man's oppression until liberty enlightens the world." So historians will look at me as a little bit of an inconsistency there. Okay. Now here's a cartoon, and this is me in retirement. There's a woman running after me with her umbrella. Who do you think that woman is?
Your wife.
No, not my wife.
Not your wife.
No,
Suffragette?
She's too young.
yes, the most well-known, maybe perhaps the most well-known suffragette.
Starts with the C. Stanton.
Well, there's Elizabeth Cady Stanton, there's Lucretia Mott, and then there's Susan B. Anthony. This is Susan B. Anthony.
Yeah.
So as president, I was mostly silent on women's suffrage. I understood the value of women's clubs and political organizations and drumming up the vote of husbands and fathers, and I didn't want to alienate either group. However, in my retirement, there was an article in the Ladies' Home Journal. It is, and I said it's a mistake to suppose that any human reason or argument is needful or adequate to the assignment of the relative positions to be assumed by man and woman in working out the problems of civilization. This was done long ago by a higher intelligence than ours. My wife, Frances, who I call Frankie, she would later become the vice president of the New Jersey Association opposed to women's suffrage. So personally, I'm opposed to women's suffrage, but I was smart enough when to say that. In retirement, I didn't see the harm of saying it then. You know, I wasn't running for anything. So, and the Ladies' Home Journal published many articles against women's suffrage in particular and women's clubs in general. And a lot of the women's clubs in this area here were initially temperance societies, women's suffrage organizations before they evolved into present-day women's clubs. The Caldwell Women's Club is very active with our group here, and they're very good to us, and we appreciate that. So, we finish up here with a couple of pictures. There's a picture of my wedding. I was actually married in the White House to a woman who was several years younger than me and who was a well-known family friend, Frances Olson Cleveland.
Was he the first one then to get married
Yes.
in the White House?
Yes. James Buchanan was never married. Woodrow Wilson's first wife passed away. He married Edith Galt, but not on the grounds of the White House after me. There's a picture of me in later life. Now, you notice my outfit here, pretty spiffy here. This would be typical of my second term, because my wife, after we married, had a big influence on my clothes. Before that, I looked a little bit more grungy. Here's a picture of me, though, of a little bit later styles, and you'll notice that the hats are evolving into a fedora. I have a necktie, and here's my family. And that's me, one of the last pictures, or perhaps the last picture I was taking before I passed away. I was passed away.
How old were you when you passed away?
How old was I when I passed away? My mind's going blank here.
Do you know Carol?
No.
I was in my late 60s.
Okay.
I didn't quite make 70. And
71.
71, okay. I did make 71, okay. So, and I retired in Princeton, New Jersey. I was buried there. I never came back here. And the folklore among some of our board members was that when my family left here in dispute and we went to New York, I sat in the cabin and said, "We're not coming back to Caldwell again." I think that's more folklore. It's hard to believe that someone who's 4 years old would have come, maybe just made a statement like that out of anger, but you never know what he might have heard from his family, or what I heard from my family. And here's a remark about citizenship. There is, in my mind, a sober conviction that we all can and ought to do more for the country that lives in us than it has been our habit to do. And so I wrote a lot in retirement when I lived in Princeton. I was on the board of directors in Princeton. I butted heads a little bit with Woodrow Wilson. And by coincidence, Woodrow Wilson, when he announced his first candidacy here in Caldwell, New Jersey, was actually here in Caldwell, New Jersey. There used to be a resort hotel down the road over here until before World War II. And that's where Mr. Wilson had announced his first candidacy as for governor of New Jersey. So, how would you rate me as a president?
Well, I'll say this. While you were a Democrat, right, you were very conservative. Very conservative?
I was a conservative Democrat. Absolutely. Today we might call that a moderate. And we might call the new Democrats coming down the road a little bit on the conservative side. Paul Maloney's interpretation is that I was a lot like Harry Truman, a conservative Democrat. Mr. Truman probably had a little bit more liberal leanings here and there with some of his executive orders to the betterment of the United States, the integration of troops after World War II, things like that. But Paul Maloney's interpretation is that there are a lot of similarities between me and President Truman for that respect. The idea of trying to end strikes, the idea of not, the bigger picture is not letting my polls determine how I was going to act as a president. And I think that's the biggest similarity with Mr. Truman.
You aren't quick to give money away either.
Yeah. And Mr. Truman was well known that as a senator and later on. Okay.
What do you think, honey?
I think in his first administration, I think the public was favorable to him. In a second administration, because of some of his choices with the labor and the fact that he vetoed a lot of bills that some people felt they would have liked. He left office with a low rating.
Yes, perhaps you are right. And it probably had a lot to do with me not pursuing another term.
Mm-hmm. But your term, when you ran the second time and you won the popular vote, but you lost the Electoral College, at that time, was there discussion about doing away with the Electoral College?
No, there wasn't. I just accepted that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And as a matter of fact, at the inauguration, I held the umbrella for my former opponent. There's a picture of me in there holding the umbrella, and I treated him with great respect. And we had dinner a few times, both before, towards the end of Benjamin Harrison's term as well. There was not I lost. That was it. Frances had a little bit of an edge to her. Supposedly, she said to the White House usher, "Leave everything where it is. We'll be back in 4 years." When I left the first term.
Wow, that's so cool. That is cool.
And she was like the Jacqueline Kennedy of the time.
Mm-hmm.
She was, the idea of popular magazines spotlighted her all the time. And we appeared in public, we got swarmed by people wanting autographs, wanting to talk to us. And shortly after our wedding, we began to talk of many different things.
Was she from an aristocratic family?
She was from the family of my former law partner, Oscar Paulson.
Mm-hmm.
And I was the executor of the estate, and I was technically her guardian. She was my ward. And so this sounds a little bit strange with our morals today, But I married her 20 some odd years younger than me.
Go ahead, honey.
But he didn't marry. I mean, he waited a long time to get married.
Another rumor is that how come Mr. Cleveland, you're not married yet? He said, well, the person I want to marry is not grown up yet. I'm not quite sure how true that is.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you had two. Okay, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
You had 2 terms, right? But they weren't consecutive.
No.
What was the cause of that? Why couldn't you pull it off?
It's just the way the Electoral College went at the time.
Oh.
To sum up, too, is that as a Democrat, I was appealing to the southern states. If you look at the electoral map, it's very much like you would find in some maps since the election of 1960 and where everything was going and things. I was the first Democrat after the Civil War. And the Republican Party had dominated for such a long time.
Yes, that's true.
I don't know if this picture is going to be on here. I hope it is. Well, here are some other things I didn't even get into today. There was a 1895 Venezuela crisis, my presidential elections, which we just touched on, my wedding, Caldwell, New Jersey history, things about my family, and a controversy with me is the Dawes Act, which is very much my approach with the Chinese immigrants, is that I did not feel that the Native Americans could assimilate into white culture. And there was a lot of issues with that. So we're not going to get into that too much now.
I got the impression that, I wouldn't say he was a racist, but that he did feel that the Europeans and non-Europeans could not form a tight-knit community. He felt that they needed to be.
I didn't have that vision, and I just felt that with the Chinese customs and things like that, I was very, focused, and also for whatever reason, the European immigrants would eventually provide more votes for me. Mm-hmm. Where the Chinese, I didn't see that in their future. If I did have that vision at all, in that case, I went with what was politically popular. Mm-hmm. One of the rare times I did that.
Were all of Grover Cleveland's siblings successful in moving up the economic level? Yes,
they in turn, two of them had served in the Civil War, and it's one of the reasons why I did not, and hired a substitute because I needed to support the family. Mm-hmm. I was probably the wealthiest of all the siblings, with my law practice, right, and my life in Buffalo.
The 24th president wasn't that different from the 22nd president. They were both lawyers from New York, they were both Democrats, and they were both Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was first elected in 1884, and he barely lost his re-election bid in 1888. Things weren't going so hot for Republicans when 1892 rolled around. The economy was bumpy, and the public was worried about the increasing power of big corporations. Voters kicked out Benjamin Harrison and brought Grover back to the White House. Unfortunately, the second time around wasn't so fun. Just months into Cleveland's term, the U.S. was rocked by the worst economic depression it had ever seen. The railroad industry was overbuilt, farmers were unable to pay their mortgages, and unemployment was at an all-time high. Grover quickly pressured Congress to cut back on the coinage of silver to fight inflation. It helped, but it ticked off rural Democrats in the West and South. Things got worse in 1894, when a huge strike by railroad workers interfered with mail delivery. Cleveland used federal troops to break it up. He thought he was well within his rights as president, but Democratic labor leaders in the North were furious. Democrats were completely divided when Cleveland left office in 1897. He had acted decisively during emergencies, but he also paved the way for 16 straight years of Republican presidents.